With recent events, I thought it was about time to come back to Okami because it has been a long time since I've talked about this game specifically. This is something I've covered on the channel in the past. This is something I'm very passionate about and have talked about at length several times over the years. But I have very strong opinions about this game. This is something I've been talking about since 2006 or so, since I first saw the game and ever since I first became interested in playing it, because it became apparent to me almost immediately that the game, although it does have a lot of things going for it, was something that got a lot of undue attention from the gaming media because this was seen as a potential Zelda killer. The PlayStation 2 equivalent of The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. And for a long time, people propped it up as such. This was a game that was really valued for its artistic integrity, for its unique mechanics, for its visual style, for the fact that you play as a wolf, right? The Japanese cultural reasons. There's a lot of reasons to love Okami for what it was, but unfortunately, much like a lot of genuinely good games over the past 20 years, game journals had to ruin it by comparing it to something that it could not possibly hope to compete with. Okami was beloved by critics, but it bombed commercially, while The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess became the highest-selling Zelda game ever at that time. Now, this isn't really something that a lot of people talk about. Once Okami came out, it was on to the next thing, but it really needs to be studied how, over the years, Okami has gone on to be seen as this cult classic, one of the absolute best in its genre, when in reality, it is absolutely a mediocre experience with a few unique mechanics that really make it stick out from its competition. Yes, if you're a fan of video games, you will get some enjoyment out of Okami. There are plenty of things to like about it, but at the end of the day, this is a 7 out of 10 title that just doesn't live up to what Zelda manages to accomplish. The difference in quality between this and the average Zelda game, or even the below average Zelda games, is palpable. It's really noticeable how Twilight Princess, as controversial as it was, how polarizing it was, how people genuinely had a lot of issues with how it handled its story and how similar it was to Ocarina of Time and things of that nature. Twilight Princess, in a lot of ways, was playing it safe for the Zelda franchise. Even a game like that has demonstrated that it is a far more iconic video game than Okami ever will be. And this is worth pointing out because most people seem to be under the impression that it's the exact opposite. That Okami is genuinely a top-tier video game that's worthy of attention and respect. That's one of the greatest of all time, when in reality, it's not true at all. Okami only excels stylistically. It has no real substance to it. The areas are lazy, the boss encounters aren't all that well thought out, the combat situations are lousy. There are things to like about Okami, right? You know, I like the structure, and I love the whole, how it feels like a fable and stuff like that. You know, the characters are all a lot of fun. The fact that there are several different antagonists that build up to like a really climactic final showdown is just wonderful. You know, I love the artistry and a lot of the core ideas, the jokes, the sense of humor. Like, it's all really good and unique, but at the same time, it needs to be understood that this game is nowhere near the quality of Zelda. If you don't understand that, you simply don't have a respect for this genre at all. Because when you look at the Zelda franchise, you're not really competing with one video game. You're competing with the iconic original. You're competing with the hard as nail sequel. You're competing with A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, two of the best games ever made. You're competing with the highly original and creative dark fantasy of Majora's Mask. You're competing with the Studio Ghibli inspired Wind Waker. You're competing with the dark and brooding Twilight Princess. And going forward, you're competing with the legendary Skyward Sword, right? You're competing with Breath of the Wild, the greatest game ever made. What does Okami do to compete with any of that? Even if you enjoy Okami, even if you love the game, there can be no denying that when you look at Zelda's insane history of high-quality products every 4 to 5 years, how exactly can a niche Japanese games from the mid-2000s ever hope to compete with that? Okami, in a lot of ways, never even came close. And this is a big thing when it comes to these kind of products, right? When it comes to these Nintendo killers. You know, I would put Astrobot as a recent example for the Mario franchise, actually. This is very similar. Like, even if these games are genuinely good and they find an audience and people genuinely love them, they're never going to eclipse these iconic brands, because these iconic brands have dozens of different games to support their franchise that people can play and experience at their leisure. When you look at the history of Nintendo, you have several options in each respective franchise to get into the games, to experience the games, to have like all these wildly different experiences that are just better than this. I think it's safe to say that, you know, even as a cult classic, Okami kind of pales in comparison to titles like Wind Waker or Majora's Mask, which are far more popular and talked about than this game is. If anything, I feel like this game only has the relevancy it does because of the gaming industry's refusal to acknowledge Nintendo's superiority. Its refusal to acknowledge that even the most wildly creative, innovative, third-party titles on PlayStation 2 that exist, you know, games like this, absolutely cannot compete with the major Nintendo properties. And this is what that PlayStation executive meant when he said that PlayStation doesn't have any relevant IPs. When you actually look at the video game franchises that people recognize, the ones that people are emotionally invested in, the ones that people remember and talk about 20 years later, you're going to see a lot of Nintendo exclusives. Games like Okami absolutely have an audience. You know, they absolutely should be played and talked about and appreciated for what they are. But that also means acknowledging their very real flaws. And I think Okami is a really interesting example of this, in that this is a game that genuinely has a lot of good things going for it, but it is also deeply flawed and rushed and could have been so much more. If you don't talk about that, then you're not really taking everything into consideration. You're not really evaluating products based on their own merits. You're evaluating them based on this idea that you're going to be downplaying a major Nintendo exclusive that year. And this is what happens all the time. This is not an isolated incident. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that this is the centerpiece of most Nintendo criticisms, is this idea that some third-party game out there exists that does what Nintendo does better. Okami is not unique in that respect, and it is something that we do need to talk about going forward, because this is just one example of how games like this, putting them on a pedestal doesn't do them any favors. because anybody who goes into this game expecting something to blow Zelda out of the water is going to come away very disappointed, like I did when I first played it back in the day. The game is doing really well in the eShop right now. It's had a huge surge of interest when they announced the sequel, but I do believe that as people play through this, there's going to be this very, very big feeling among the community that, like, wow, Zelda was always better than this. Okami was never a Zelda killer.